welcome everyone to the second installment of Food Security and Climate Resiliency web series that we have going on for the month of May through our RSI Step Up initiative. Very excited to see how much interest there's been in this topic. We had a very engaged first session last week. For those who weren't able to make it, the recording will be posted soon, and please go and have a listen. Had quite a robust conversation with some panelists, very much focused on inequalities in our system, in ways to reduce waste, and also shone a light on the uptick of the need through COVID at the Daily Bread Food Bank and other emergency food service. Very relevant conversation. We're all extremely familiar with the inflationary pressures that we're experiencing at the moment and expect to continue. Had no idea until recently how much grain the Ukraine supplied. And obviously there's going to be knock-on benefits, unfortunately, from some lack of production that's no doubt going to be occurring in this harvest season as a result of the geopolitical instability there. I'm Patrick Gossage, Director at Rethink Sustainability Initiative. So just as a quick reminder for those who are new to RSI, really what we're about, always forward thinking, trying to imagine what a more ideal society looks like, always through the lens of sustainability. That's at our core, but our focus is really providing a forum where intelligent, forward-thinking panelists, like the ones you're going to hear from today, can get together in a room and discuss ideas and discuss about what a better future looks like. So very excited again for the series today. We're going to have more of a farming food production focus for this installment of the series. So without further ado, I would like to introduce you to the founder of RSI, Yasmin Glanville, who's a futurist, an innovation strategist, very much a systems thinker, as you'll hear, an implementation advisor.
Thank you very much, Patrick, for those very kind words, and thanks for the great introduction. Welcome, everybody. As Patrick said, it's a four-part series, and today the focus is on locally sourced food, and it's both urban and rural, and also from a policy perspective. So the meta theme is transitioning to health promoting and locally sourced sustainable food supply for Canada. And because we work in a world that has no boundaries, it would include maybe potentially as well the United States. Our process is a facilitated knowledge sharing and Q&A. What that means is that each person on the panel will speak about from their point of view, urban, rural, and policy and so forth, but also there'll be some dialogue going back and forth. If you have any questions, put them in the chat. For the webinar format, there's no coming on directly verbally, but we will be monitoring the chat. Looking at it as a whole system, we always start from reimagining a possible future. So in systems thinking, which maybe you do already, it always starts from a future vantage point and looks back at the present. There's an axiom that says, we can't get there from here, but we can get here from there. So I invite everybody on the call today to imagine, what is your imagined future? With respect to food security, food supply, and any of the intersecting, points. And then looking at the marketplace today, what are some of the emerging trends, problems, opportunities that might be impacting the success of that vision? Then the focus is the present tense. So we look at the future, scan some trends that reinforce or challenge those assumptions, and focus on what's on the ground right now, what's possible. So on the ground today, we're talking to people who actually work in the farming world from a policy and on the ground perspective. So it's very rooted, excuse the pun. And once we find that focus, what are some strategies and things we can do to act on that, to bring it to life? And then once we get that, we build it, we use that, we monitor, we measure, and we keep repeating that. So in systems thinking, it's a very iterative process, and it's not looking at anything in a linear way. They're all interconnected. So in the middle, we put down food supply, but food supply has many meanings. So the vision. If the vision is to transition to a future that we talked about, what are some of the things disrupting that? So at a meta level, there are convergent disruptions that are impacting that transition. The different bubbles are color coded because they're clusters. I'm not going to read them all in detail. You're all going to get a copy of this anyway. But look at some of the immediate threats. War. It's on the news. People might experience it. You may have family members there, sadly, but it's on the ground. Also, the attack to our human rights. And that's another story all by itself. And the pandemic. We've lived with it now for 2 years. And it's really, there's no boundary for that. And it is immediate and it is a threat. And there's no end in sight, sadly. There's also chronic conditions, income inequality. That's been around for a while. And the whole, also escalating climate crisis, which has many meanings and different interpretations. I'm not going to read all the bubbles, but I'll give you a high level of the rest. There's technology, AI, for example. Remember back in 2018, everyone talked about the role being taken over by robots. Well, guess what? We have robots happening already. We just can't see them. And it's not always a bad thing. There's, for example, precision diagnostic and farming using AI to assess soil, as an example, machine learning, and other things. The other is on there's a labor shortage right across the supply chain. It's from the manufacturing and the farm and distribution in the restaurants and people who serve. And we all know what that's like. So again, the center point there is food supply across the system. So who are these wonderful people we're going to hear about today? Well, we have Brenda Sharhay, and Brenda is an organic farmer, and her and her partner own Black Sheep Farm. We'll hear more about her. Dr. Matt Hammond, he's a chief technology officer and an ecologist working with High Garden. And Dr. Rod McCrae is a food policy analyst and associate professor at York University with the Faculty of Environmental and Urban Change. We hear from each person separately as well and on the dialogue. Let's go on to High Garden. So over to you, Matt. Just a little bit of who you are, what High Garden is, and what differentiates you, and how are you helping with that transition?
Sure. Thank you, Yasmin, for the introduction. At High Garden, we're developing technologies for urban agriculture. And so our perspective here is how urban agriculture can really play a big role in ensuring food supply, resilience, those sorts of things. The context for our work is that cropland has been dwindling. It hasn't been keeping up with the population growth that we have. And this has been okay for a while because yields of food keep on going up and up and up. But I think we're all aware that we may be heading into a crunch, and already there are signs that climate change is undercutting the productivity of agriculture. And we expect we think that this creates a need. And the need is that urban spaces are going to become much more important for growing food. There are so many overlooked spaces in cities, and these are probably going to be important to make up a future shortfall. In fact, it's hard to imagine a future that isn't going to involve urban agriculture. At High Garden, the approach that we use to deliver on the promise of urban agriculture is that we try to copy nature. We try to copy the zero waste model of ecosystems in order to grow more food in buildings with lower environmental impact. So this process starts off in the bottom left of the picture there with organic and as low impact inputs as we can. So for instance, in our systems, we have some soil-based systems that one of the main components of those is worm casts, which is a sustainable and readily available source of nutrients. We use biochar. Some of the listeners might be familiar with biochar that locks away carbon for anywhere from 50 to 2,000 years. So it can be carbon negative when it's used as a growing substrate. And these feed into the process of farming, which is diversified and integrated farming. It's diversified because we actually use 3 different kinds of growing methods. We use an organic soil-based agriculture. We use organic aquaponics. We use some hydroponics, which aren't based on synthetic fertilizers. They're more natural, naturally occurring nutrients. And so what this lets us do is grow a wider range of vegetables and products than you would be able to with just one of them. And it's integrated farming because we've been working for a number of years on how to connect these processes together so that waste from one of these growing methods can be used to fuel another one. And this is done through methods that some people might know, like vermicomposting and some other nutrient recovery methods. And so the outputs from these are value-added products and services. And the scale that we're looking at, we're not talking about huge vertical farms here. We're talking about at the community level. So at the scale of individual households, community centers, slightly larger, but still considered small farms. And so the types of outputs that we're delivering is food sovereignty, because it's at this scale where it's granular enough that people can have more of a say in what food is grown and to be able to use it directly in their communities. And because we use 3 different growing methods in a single space, it can deliver a more diverse produce than just using a single growing method like hydroponics. And then the last thing is that is because we try to use everything and not have any single waste, there is stuff that comes out of the back end of the farm. So, biochar uses its efficiency for the purposes that we use it for after a couple of years. And we're working on how we can turn this into a valuable soil amendment or fertilizer, so that so that it has a second life, that it can be buried in people's garden, increase their own capability, and also create another revenue stream for people to sell those and sort of add to the economic potential of these sorts of farms. So we've had a few opportunities to translate this idea into action, and so these are some pilot projects that have occurred and are unfolding as we speak. The first of these is an off-grid food shed in Brampton, Ontario, and so this is testing the idea of whether we can go completely off-grid, generate all renewable energy, use rainwater harvesting to grow food for the community there as part of the backyard gardening program out in Brampton. The second of these is the Oasis Microfarm Network. It's in St. Jamestown in Toronto. And it's testing an idea of whether we can have a single hub farm and distribute little tiny microfarms into apartments in a high density, low income neighborhood to increase the people's access to fresh food supply there. And then the third is testing the idea that we can have private organic farms at the Country Heritage Park out in Milton, Ontario, to test that as a model for just running. This is a slightly larger farm, but still fairly small in scale, to produce fresh fish and vegetables out of there. And so what do these 3 projects have in common? I would say that they are all new uses of spaces that we've overlooked, spaces in the urban area, in the built environment. And what we're trying to do is to take a fresh look at those and figure out how we can best use them to grow food for the future. Thank you.
Thank you, Matt. Thank you very much. That's wonderful. I'm going to turn it over now to you, Brenda, to talk about who you are and what you do and where do you stand with respect to, the transition to sustainable food.
All right, perfect. So I am an organic vegetable and sheep farmer in Grey County, Ontario. So it's about 2.5 hours northwest of Toronto. And I've been farming here for about 13 years. I also work with Farmers for Climate Solutions, which is really looking at teaching a lot of regenerative ag techniques, such as rotational grazing and cover cropping, also further nitrogen management. So the idea of regenerative agriculture is mostly that we are really emphasizing biodiversity, because having a whole system that actually imitates nature is what will actually be able to help us both produce food as well as regenerate the land. So the thing that regenerative agriculture really does require, though, is a lot more farmers. I don't know if you guys know the stats, but all of Canada, only about 2% is farming. And of that 2%, I have no idea of how many people are actually using regenerative agriculture. I'm going to guess less than 10%. So if we really want to have local food production systems in place, a very large portion of Canadians need to actually be farming. And so that means that farming itself needs to be more appealing. It needs to be accessible. And that could be like what Matt's talking about, urban farming. There's definitely a lot of urban farming that's starting to take place in the GTA. But it also means that a lot of the farms that are farmed industrially right now need to be moving towards more human-based, labor-intensive farming systems that really takes a good look at the systems that they live in. So it's not what I'm going to refer to as like an Instapot farming, which is a set it and forget it, put in your chemicals, put in your seeds, come back, 6 months later and harvest your crops. This is really something that involves a lot more what's not working and modifying their systems from year to year to both maximize efficiency of production, but also resilience in the long term. So, this is not really what, say, governments or whatnot promote all the time, but with Farmers for Climate Solutions and with other organic farmers within my social groups or whatnot, this is what we're looking for. Like, I came into farming because of the climate crisis. I left the financial industry more than 10 years ago because I could see that climate change was very real and that we would really have to start changing the way that we produce food if we wanted to have any chance of surviving everything in the future. So not to be a Debbie Downer or anything, but I do think we need to make some major changes in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you, Brenda. We look forward to hearing more about that in the panel dialogue as well. So over to you, Ron. Want to say a little bit about yourself and what your focus is?
Thanks, Yasmin. Yeah, my work is all about creating the detailed elements of a joined up food policy, one that is really about health, justice, and sustainability. And it will require, and both Matt and Brenda have already made reference to some of this, it will require changes to all aspects of the food system, right from farm inputs to food retailing, and even the design of our kitchens and our bathrooms, which are really still part of the food system. So I focus on government policy because even though many are discouraged often about certain levels of inaction on the governmental side, government is critical to driving all this forward. In other words, important as community-based initiatives are, they will run up against what's referred to as the dominant system at one point. And although they can have some impact on the dominant system, ultimately it is government policy and other kinds of instruments that will help drive these community-based changes. So in a way, the challenge of government is to scale up and out the concepts and the practices that both Brenda and Matt are referencing. Now, unfortunately, in Canada, we have what's sometimes described as a significant implementation gap. In other words, the instruments that are being employed to generate change are not sufficient to get us where we want to go. It's not necessarily the case that we don't have good visions of sustainable change or good principles. It's that we're not putting in place the right kinds of instruments to bring it to fruition. And that's really what my work is about, outlining on my website, which you can see down there at the bottom of this slide, the hundreds of detailed strategies that must be put in place to move us in the right direction. And in doing so, of course, we want to be supporting a lot of individual firms and community organizations, but equally it's important that these actors become much better at policy advocacy. And that's what a lot of my work is also about, is helping community-based organizations improve their policy advocacy skills, so that they can have a bigger impact on government approaches to these challenges. Thank you.
So we're going to move into a dialogue. And so if all the viewers have been making note if there are any questions that you might have, or if they can just put them in the chat room again. All right, so first question I have is, first of all, your work is fantastic. I want to acknowledge all three of you. The policy is really important because we just finished a whole project with a large community, in fact, St. Jamestown. And you're right, the policy is a big thing that people need to know. Policy advocacy is a skill that most people don't have. And the fact that you're doing that is quite admirable. And the fact that you, Matt, and Brenda are on the ground actually producing food, in a rural capacity and and urban as well. And the common link there is you're using a systems approach in organic as well, and connecting the dots with climate resiliency and climate change, as are you, Rod, in the work you're doing indirectly. So a couple of questions I'm going to ask, and in terms of process, whoever wants to answer the question, just answer it. The first one, how do you encourage more urban agriculture on a community level and or a policy level? Who wants to answer that? Or repeat the question, how do you encourage more urban or agriculture on a community level and or a city policy level?
I can try to answer that, Yasmin.
Okay.
I think there's a couple of ways that we can really make good on urban agriculture. I think the first, and I won't say it's the most important, but maybe equally important to policies, but is to get the right social model. So a lot of what we do at Highgarden is to put thought into how we can best connect the technology with people, and we've tried this and are continuing to try different models of it. So in the 3 pilot projects that I showed you, one could be considered sort of at the community level. It's organized through municipality. The produce is going to go to community members. We've also run a community out of a community center, an indoor farm that we've given food to food banks for many years now. So that's one model. Another model is the private ownership one of whether you can create these small farms within an urban area and really make sure that they're profitable enough to keep people going as sort of a micro entrepreneur, micro economy sort of model. And then the third is more of a distributed approach where it's actually taking place in people's homes. And it's amazing when you start looking around your home and understand some of the technologies that you actually can produce quite a lot of food in your house. And it doesn't have to be in your face. It can be in your basement. It can be on your windowsill. I just finished harvesting a little crop of beans as an experiment with my 4-year-old daughter off of our kitchen countertop. There's so many places that we can make a difference. But one of the challenges, and this is an experimental phase, I think, for figuring out the urban agriculture, how it's going to fit in, is figuring out where it's going to work best at which of those scales. And also the scale that I haven't mentioned is the large commercial scale that everybody is probably familiar with, vertical farms and that sort of thing. So figuring out the social model is the first thing, and then having the policies in place to make that as easy as possible, and also to have it be incentivized as well. I answered a question in the chat forum a minute ago, and it was a question along the lines of what municipal governments can do, and my answer would be the same to this. Incentives would certainly go a long way. Some jurisdictions have put in sort of tax credits for people who grow food in urban areas. That could be something to try. What if there was a 2% tax break on food that you're growing that is also donated to food banks, that sort of thing. So there might be some incentives there, and then also certainly there's going to need to be some changes in bylaws, I think, to make it easier for people to grow food. I think people are probably aware that there's been in various jurisdictions chicken wars about whether we should have chickens within city limits or not. These are the things that have to and will change in the future.
Thank you. I saw you're nodding there. Do you want to talk about the policy side on that, Rod?
Yeah, well, Matt's made some nice references to some of the key features. I mean, the big dilemma, of course, is that cities don't think of food production as a city process. There's been this obvious separation of urban and rural, which is longstanding. And so in many ways, a lot of the policy drivers are about reducing that distance between urban and rural and integrating these spaces to some degree. So a lot of the problem is that the urban spaces, of course, there's so much competition for uses. And municipalities generally, there's some great examples to contradict this, but in general, municipalities have not protected spaces for food production. Obviously, if you're a private landowner, you can do things, but when it's more of a commercial process or when it's more of a community process, that becomes one of the challenges. And even though we have many of the possible instruments in place to use, a lot of them aren't necessarily well designed. Again, getting back to my implementation gap problem. So, for example, Toronto has a roof bylaw, but it doesn't really work very well for food production. It works well for putting some kind of cover on the roof, but it isn't really that suitable for food production. So these are the kinds of things that will require some detailed interventions, some detailed transitions. And again, on my research website, I go into some detail on all the different things that cities would have to do to support urban food production.
I'm going to stay on that word rooftop. One of our chat questions is, how do you put in, and is it possible to have a rooftop garden in Toronto? So how would you answer that based on what you just said now?
Well, it's definitely possible, but Matt may have more to say about this. But the engineering is a big issue. Obviously, if you design a site from the beginning so that you can grow food on a roof, which adds additional weight, and also there are clearly security issues for being up on many roofs, and access issues. But the engineering side of it is critical. So often what happens is that there's a lot of interest in a building, say, in doing something on the roof, but the design of the building doesn't accommodate that reality. And then transitioning the site and dealing with issues around liability and who actually controls what happens on the roof and what comes off it, these kinds of questions becomes a big part of the transition process. But it's definitely feasible. But again, we're not putting the right supports in place to make it much easier. So anybody who does it is really pioneering at this point.
Thank you. I want to bring the attention now to you, Brenda, in terms of the question I asked about encouraging more, I would say rural, and also connecting it with urban agriculture, because even though you're in the country, you do connect with the city as well. Is that correct?
Yes, actually, the majority of eaters are in cities as opposed to in the rural environment. And in the rural environment, having space to grow your own food isn't generally the problem, it's having time. And so actually, a lot of the issues to do with rural and urban production have to do with just having the labor time to set up all these things, to navigate the rules and your neighbors. This also happens in a rural environment as well. And I would say that for all the sort of policymakers out there, both rural and urban, if you look at if you were to say, look at all the policies and look at land use policies, there are all sorts of weird barriers to producing food, both on a rural and an urban basis, that should probably get re-examined in the next few years to actually encourage more food production. So for example, if you're looking at in a urban setting, new developments or whatnot, perhaps you need to include in there community gardens, or include in there not prioritizing parking spaces or lawns over food production. I know there are definitely neighbor wars over lawns versus gardens, right? That's happened in a lot of different municipalities. So there really has to be a change in mindset over what it is that your yard should look like. And on a rural level, the size of farms, there's definitely a push against subdividing too much, because then you're really breaking up too much farmland. But the type of farming that can actually make a living has changed. You could be a market gardener and only need a 10-acre piece of land instead of having to try to find financing for a 100-acre piece of land. So I think that if you put policies in place that prioritize setting up a range of different kinds of farming from the small to the large, as opposed to one-size-fits-all policies that only encourage one type of anything, we'll be able to start developing some of that food production resilience in the long term.
Thank you very much. Building on all three of what you just said, would there be any value in creating a cohort of people, maybe around a project, around that one shared thing about looking at, the food supply in terms of urban, rural, integrating that, looking at some of the policies that might be barriers to that? Would you see a value in that as an action?
I see value in just having people consider agriculture as a real career. So, families should be encouraging kids from a young age to grow things. Schools should be encouraging it. I mean, when's the last time at the elementary school level, like kids actually learn that you could be a farmer and that it's just as good of a job as being a doctor or a dentist. I come from an immigrant background. Going into farming was definitely not something encouraged by my family, and it was seen as a very strange thing. So I think that on a policy level, just right across our culture, we need to start thinking about what are the good jobs, what makes them good jobs, what makes them something to strive for. And, you know, coming from a background of being very good in math and being in the finance world and doing biochemistry and all those things, farming is an extremely challenging job that is very fulfilling. And you cannot do this if you are not thinking on your feet every single day. And I think this is something that is not credited towards farmers enough, that it is something that the most intelligent of our society needs to be participating in, instead of having such a large percentage of our population withdrawn from it. We've lost our connection with nature and with the land that we live on. And this has led to so many social justice and everything sicknesses along the way. So it really starts right at the school level, right in our homes. People need to be visiting farms, urban, rural. People need to see how food is produced. And every kid needs to grow a bean in a cup at home when they're 5 and be able to see how plants grow. They need to know that chocolate milk doesn't come from brown cows. I mean, the things that we hear in the farming community that would really where education could really play a huge role to inspire another generation of farmers. I think that's one of our most important things.
Any comments from Rod or Matt on what Greta just said?
Yeah, if I could just add to that, and it connects to one of the questions in the Q&A about food policy councils, is that part of our dilemma here is what's sometimes called food system governance. So, you know, historically, we've had a very limited number of actors, both governmental and non-governmental, who are determining how the food system functions. And equally significant is that Canada has the most oligopolized food system in the Western world, the fewest number of strong economic players who dominate how supply chains work. And we've allowed that to happen. This isn't a natural process. This is a function of, I would say, a function of failed policy. But the key thing here is that there are a lot of opportunities with different kinds of models of discussion and advice and implementation to bridge the rural-urban divide. And many cities in Canada, some number over 60 or 70 cities in Canada and regions of Canada now have these municipally based food policy councils. And their function is really to try and encourage municipal governments to intervene in the food system within at least their boundaries, but also to make new kinds of linkages to what's happening with rural producers. The challenge, of course, for municipalities is that they have the least authority in the system. I mean, in many ways, our food system problems are related to the fact that the BNA Act of 1867 is actually a mess for governing the food system. And so municipalities have the least authority, but they are, of course, closest to the population. So they see the problems often more acutely. And that is part of the reason why they've created these bodies, these food policy councils. And the most effective ones have municipal funding. The Toronto Food Policy Council had municipal funding for years. I was the first coordinator starting back in 1990. A fascinating learning experience for me, but also it showed to me the possibilities of trying to shift some of the decision making to a wider array of actors than what we currently see in the decision making process.
Thank you. You want to comment on that, Matt?
Yes, I'll just add one thing that I think what you said, Rod, and what you said, Brenda, it all I think it's all helped along by engagement. And just to add a voice of optimism, we have seen a big difference since the pandemic started. I mean, everybody knows there was a run on seeds and growing stuff at home, and that was, of course, of great interest to us. And we've noticed since that time, you know, much more appreciation for this kind of discussion. And so, you know, hopefully that means is it just because people were at home bored and looked at their yards differently, or did they sort of pick up the signal that we were very close to having acute food supply issues during the pandemic? You know, the first thing I did back when the pandemic started was plant some potatoes in my backyard, and didn't need to be fighting over them with my neighbor or anything like that. But you know, I think the thinking could be could be changing, and I think we'll see in the next year or so whether it holds. And I think if that is the case, then hopefully we'll get more engagement, more uptake with young people becoming farmers. They're the demographic that's showing the most interest in growing food these days. And you know, hopefully that filters up to the municipal level as well, that the municipal level follows kind of the grassroots sentiment. So I'm optimistic on that front, and I think it's worth noting that.
On the engagement front, I have a question for all three of you. How do you engage corporations? Because if you look, for example, back to the pandemic, I mean, large grocery chains, like, you know, I won't say the names on public here, but, you know, they served a need. They were seen as an essential need, of course, and they are, as is health. So, but how do we engage people like that? The large grocery stores, the food manufacturers, people who buy your products, Brenda, to make food in restaurants and stores and resell it. And what you're doing also with High Garden, or from a policy point of view, how do we engage them? Because, you know, going back to the divide in our research, RSI, we saw there was a big divide between large corporations, communities, and then decision makers, like, for example, policy councils and so on. They weren't connecting necessarily. How do we connect that? How do we engage them so that there are more people at the table who are decision makers who can get involved and support what you're talking about? Anybody?
Well, I could start. Certainly, these food policy councils typically have representatives from the dominant food sector.
Okay.
And that's obviously challenging because, you know, people come to these roundtable processes with different sets of values and experiences. And often the first meetings are a bit messy as everybody's trying to stake out their territory. But what typically happens in these kinds of environments is that everybody gains a fuller understanding of the realities of others. So I would say, related to your question, that the issue is not so much engaging the corporate sector, but rather engaging them in ways that moves the way they work. Because obviously, if you're a large corporation, you have a different set of objectives than, you know, say the public sector has, or the community sector has. And so the challenge is to help them move in directions that are helping us actually solve food system problems. A lot of what's happening in the private sector on the surface appears to be a solution to the kinds of problems we're talking about, but in reality, it reinforces a lot of the status quo processes that are taking us down the wrong road. So to be effective at that is a bit like what I said earlier about policy advocacy. If you're a community advocate and you want to work with corporations, you have to get very skilled at understanding their reality, understanding the language and the processes they work with, and then trying to figure out detailed proposals on how to help them change what they want to do without appearing to be caught up in some kind of a greenwashing activity, which of course regularly corporations are accused of. Big challenge, obviously, but certainly there are people who are doing it and have developed the skill sets to be more effective at it.
To dumb that down a little bit, just for my sake, what's one example? What's one thing a person can do to move in that direction? Anybody?
Well, of course, the typical thing everybody talks about is using your dollar as a vote. And, you know, and that does work, but it only really works if you actually tell the people you're buying from that you're doing it. So there were many classic stories from Europe, for example, during the debates in the late 1990s and early 2000s about genetically engineered organisms. And there were many activists who organized campaigns of shoppers, basically, who would go into stores and they would say things like, well, I'll only buy the things in your store that don't have genetically engineered organisms as part of the production process. And of course, at that point in time, most of the people working in the stores had no idea what this all meant. And that created lots of chaos, and people would go to the checkout lines and they'd say, well, which of these items in my basket are GMO free, this kind of thing. So, you know, you can do that kind of work for sure, but it does require that you tell somebody what you're doing and why you're doing it. Otherwise, it doesn't have the same spillover effects through the corporate leadership structures.
So I'm hearing that it's clear communication. Patrick, what about, not Patrick, Matt, what about yourself?
In terms of what actions can be taken to
Jump in too, Brenda, please.
Could you repeat the question, Yasmin?
Yeah, the question is, what's something that people can do to bridge the gap between corporate and private sector who have the means, financial, and also the reach to help make a difference, and people on the street, and also the consumer, the buyer, and also farmers?
I don't have a firm thought on that.
I think Brenda does.
Good. Over to Brenda then.
Okay, so as you might imagine, I'm very strongly opinionated in all these things. This might sound like a strange thing to do, but we need to learn to cook only what is seasonal in our areas. So grocery stores are bringing in strawberries, bananas, all that. Okay, well, I'm going to leave bananas out of the picture because the banana is kind of holy in its own way. But like, for example, strawberries, they're available all the time. People are very used to a very wide variety of non-seasonal vegetables being available all the time. And so their cooking reflects that. The cooking of our society reflects what is available in a grocery store. And as a result, the grocery store is what pushes our own eating. If we take control of that, if we learn what is actually available at farmers markets, at farms, what we can grow in our own backyards, and we also need to expand what we can grow to have more global crops, and that is very possible. But if we make that change in our own households to understand better, then we stop buying strawberries out of season at the grocery store. We stop buying imports from other countries that don't need to be here, that we don't need to have all the time. That is one way that we can actually start pushing grocery stores as well. But this is huge. Not a lot of people actually know how to cook, right? It's not part of our school curriculums. Home ec isn't the big deal it was when I was a little kid anymore. And, it shouldn't just be for girls, right? Like, it should be for the whole population, that we learn and understand our seasons, the seasonality of food, the seasonality of cooking. And if we could change that, then we won't have that demand for all of the exports anymore. If we start to learn what we can actually obtain from within Canada or within.
I think Brenda has frozen again, so we may come back. So while we're waiting for Brenda to come back, Brenda lives in the country, so internet in the country is not always. Oh, you're back. Okay.
I don't want to make it seem like, just because we can cook our own stuff that we change the world, because other things have to happen too.
Thank you. That's very, very good answer. We have a question from the audience here. One is that we are proposing, I'll read it to you, proposing to implement a rooftop farming in a private school as part of an enhanced horticulture and heritage farming model. We'd delight to know if this has been done anywhere else to your knowledge, and if so, what technologies would be helpful in making this come to life? Who wants to answer?
I can try to answer that one. The private schools that I'm aware of, it's been quite common these days to put in greenhouses, and the food security and food supply side is becoming a bigger and bigger part of curricula, and that's sort of something that we've tried to develop along the side with our farms. But in terms of private schools, I think if it was rooftop, I can't think of an example of that happening. So technology wise, I think certainly engineering factors into it, as Rod was saying before, that you need the roof support, and generally it's the same thing, the same sorts of challenges as green roofs, that you look at the type of substrate. It has to be quite light, and then you have to look at the kinds of plants. If it's got a greenhouse, then there's probably quite a bit that you can grow in there, like up on top of a roof. If it's exposed, then you have some of the limitations of being in a cold country, up high, exposed to wind and frost, that sort of thing. So these are some of the sort of technological considerations. But in terms of what you can put in there, assuming like you've got a site that's amenable to it, urban agriculture has a bunch of very interesting technologies. It ranges from the low tech, which is just soil or something lighter than soil, like a potting mix, that sort of thing, that you can grow any number of plants in, to the very high tech and fancy. But even the high tech and fancy, hydroponics has come down in price. You've got aeroponics, you've got aquaponics. I'm not sure I could imagine fish up on a roof, but anything's possible, I suppose. So there's a wide range of technologies to look into, and they can be combined in various ways to interesting effect. And a lot of them are very educational because being a biologist in education minded person in general, there's just they involve different processes of plant biology and organisms and things, and it's in a school setting. They're really, really neat, and there's going to be more and more of these applications. It sounds like a very cool project.
Yes, and I believe there are some schools in the TDSB that are working with Food Share Toronto on some of what Matt is talking about. So if people want to follow up with Food Share, they could probably get more on that. But also to reference something else Matt said, which I think is very important, is that the schools need their own kind of social model as well. So that the technology side is obviously one thing, but the schools and the TDSB policies, and even the board of, the Ministry of Education provincially, again, there's this massive implementation gap going on where a lot of these things are promoted in official documents, but there's very little support from the various decision-making places in the system to help the folks on the ground who actually have some brilliant ideas and are trying to cobble together implementation plans. So this again speaks to the need, which has been referenced already. We're not very good at transition. We don't have the right kind of transition supports. We're not offering the right kind of transition incentives. We don't have transition advisory services, whether urban or rural, to help people make the transition to sustainability. We're not encouraging people to eat sustainable diets. Brenda made some reference already to some of the elements of that. Really what needs to happen, and it has happened in some other countries, is that the Canada Food Guide has to be transformed into the Canada Sustainable Diet Guide. We're not doing that yet. We're way behind countries like Brazil and a few others that have made major strides in this area. So all this again speaks to the need for transition system thinking, which again, we're weak on.
I want to build on that transition system thinking. And another point there is, I'm going to go back to you, Brenda, but going back to the schools as well. I'll come back to what you said. Now in schools, what can the kids do? What can they do to socialize the whole notion of agriculture and cooking and food? Like Montessori schools, for example, they encourage children to connect with nature, outdoors, indoors, and understand, where food comes from, as opposed to going to a grocery store. So if they can't build in the school a rooftop garden for the reasons you talked about, Matt, and also you referenced Rod as well, what can they do?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think the most successful models are fully integrate as much as possible the students into these processes, whether it's the growing processes. Some of them have even integrated what comes from production in the school gardens. Obviously, this would be mostly a fall term activity. They've integrated that into the cafeteria processes. So as the kids are involved in the preparation, the growing and the preparation. So those are the most successful models, but often, of course, there are significant infrastructure constraints. Do we have the right space for growing? Do we have a cafeteria that will allow this to happen? Are there liability issues? Are there complications related to staffing contracts that won't allow the kids to work with staff? These are some of the nuanced barriers that exist in a lot of our processes, and it's not unique to the schools. And again, we're not really doing a good job of thinking that through and making the right kinds of changes necessarily.
Thank you. I have two more questions before we move over back to Patrick again. And one is, there was talk about the labor shortage right across the whole supply chain. How do we address that? And what are some things being done now already to address that? Any of you?
Well, we do have a massive labor force development problem in the food system. In a way, what happened in the 60s from the policy side is that governments decided that it was easier to import workers than it was to actually have a coherent plan for assuring labor across the food system. And of course, the contradictory thing that was happening at the time, and my father was actually affected by this, he grew up on a farm in Cape Breton during the Depression. And all the messages to farm kids in those days were, don't stay on the farm, go to the city and work in the industrial workforce. So in a way, the current problems are blowback from earlier policy failures. And there are groups that are working on this that are connected to the industry itself. There's the Canadian Agricultural Human Resource Council, which is regularly putting out plans. I would describe them as somewhat limited because they're not really addressing the full range of issues that are in play. They tend to focus more on things like temporary foreign worker programs, but they're gradually expanding the range of issues they realize need to be addressed. And Brenda referenced a lot of the really critical ones, which is we've done a poor job, again, partly because of these earlier policy failures, of making people feel like farming and food system work was actually a valuable undertaking. And part of that, again, is that we don't treat food for what it is. I mean, food, air, and water, the three biological requirements for life, and air and water, we still treat somewhat as public goods. We don't always treat them well as public goods, but you don't have to reach into your wallet and your purse in order to breathe and drink, but you do for food primarily. Most of us aren't self-provisioning anymore. So this notion that that food is so fundamental to human survival has not somehow been translated through labor force markets, because if people understand that, then it creates a real inspiration for being in this sector. And as Matt says, a lot of young people have grasped onto that, and that's why they're so keen on working in this area.
Thank you. Do you want to comment on that, Brenda or Matt?
Sure, I can say what Rod just said speaks to, I think, some of the potential of urban areas as well. If you think about, there's a confluence of some interesting factors there that, you know, first of all, people growing their own food, it's becoming more and more popular. It was sort of about 1 in 4 Canadians before the pandemic. A Dalhousie group put it at like 1 in 2 since the pandemic. Maybe it's not that high, but there's interest there. The interest tends to be in young people, and young people tend to be interested in living in cities more so than the older generation. So there could be an interesting opportunity there that you know, in terms of people willing to put the labor into growing food in urban places, whether it's indoors or whether it's in sort of you know, brownfield sites in the future, could be a possibility. That may be an interesting new feature of labor. That you know, you may actually have the interest in engagement in younger ones, which is quite different than what Rod's father experienced.
Right. Thank you. Brenda, do you want to comment on that?
Can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yeah, I think
Thank
we
you.
should actually have some sort of a national apprenticing program. I mean, we have them for all sorts of trades. I think we should bring something back to actually recruit new farmers. And maybe there would be the same sorts of grants or EI related type subsidies towards farms to be teaching people to become farmers. But I do think that needs to happen more targeted. Like, we actually need to be trying to get more farmers. I think, yes, like with Rod's father, everybody's trying to get out of farming. But if we want to see farmers 10 years from now, we have to start getting everyone back into it. So apprenticeship programs, there are definitely some farm programs, like business planning programs out there, with Ignatius Farm in Guelph, with Everdale Farm in Hillsburg, the Ecological Farmers Association of Ontario. There's a few actually free farm business planning courses available right now for anyone who's ever considered it. The biggest barrier to actually getting people farming is actually land access, but that's probably a discussion for a whole other day. But if we really want to start recruiting, I think an apprenticeship program could help.
Thank you. And then earlier stage as well, is what about field trips, getting kids from elementary school to have field trips to go to farms, whether it's an urban farm or a rural farm, to socialize that, going back to that social model you talked about? That be of any value, do you
Yes,
think?
definitely, lots of fun.
Yeah, okay. The last
Yes,
question I have,
kids, if they get to see what it's like.
pardon?
Yes, definitely farm.
Oh, sorry, you're breaking up there. Did you want to comment, Rod? I can see you raising your hand.
Well, of course, and I understand the kind of pressures that farmers feel around these things. I mean, absolutely, the more we can integrate food into learning processes is critical. and to some extent, field trips can be part of that. But of course, what's happening in a lot of operations is there are major fears about biosecurity. And of course, the more
Right.
people you have visiting your operation, the more challenging that becomes. So understandably, a lot of farmers are reluctant to engage in some of these kinds of things. So that's a key part of the challenge. But I think there in many ways the only time we had a really coherent food policy in this country, a real joined up food policy, was World War II. And obviously war conditions are different from everything else, but there are so many lessons to be learned from that period. And one of them was that all kinds of people who weren't necessarily traditional agricultural workers or food system workers were involved in food system work, and they were trained to do so. Obviously, you have to be skilled to be a food system worker, and there was a whole infrastructure around helping make that happen. And obviously, it's more complex now. The kinds of technologies we have now are way different than in World War II. But there are certain lessons from that we need to bring to bear to our current dilemmas.
Thank you. Yeah, one final question, and that is, do you have any closing comment, any wishes, some reimagined future, anything you want to talk about? So stand into the future for a moment, and then any closing comments about that. I'll start with you, Rod.
Well, just to reiterate, I think there's hundreds and hundreds of things we need to be doing, and that's what my website is about. But I would say, if I had to pick the top 3 things that will drive us towards sustainability, health, and justice, and my website is organized around 10 sub goals related to those.
What is the name of your
things.
website? You can just say it out
The
loud.
Food Policy for Canada.info.yorku.ca.
Thank you.
The key thing, I think the 3 maybe the most critical things are moving towards a sustainable diet, because unfortunately, traditionally, policymakers have focused pretty much on the supply side and not on the demand side. And really what we need is what's called demand-supply coordination. We need to align what we're producing with what we need to eat for optimal health and sustainability. So a lot of my site is about that. So the sustainable diet movement is critical. The transition advisory services for all kinds of farmers, particularly making the transition to sustainability, and then transition payments, because the transition period is the most challenging, and they've been used very effectively in Europe, and we're not really doing any of that in Canada. So we've got to encourage our governments to move in that direction.
Thank you very much. That goes back to what you're talking about, Brenda, about the food, sustainable diet. Want to comment on that?
Well, yes, I totally agree with Rod on that. And I'll just reiterate that we need more farmers. We need young farmers, we need old farmers, we need people to join food production. And that includes in the food processing side. We need more butchers, we need more people at abattoirs. We just really need to have more medium and small organizations all around local communities to be able to supply food. So for that, we need tons more people in food.
Thank you. Matt?
I think both Roderick and Brenda, you both sort of mentioned things about the diversity of things that were needed. And my final thoughts would be about the need to have a portfolio of solutions. We often tend to think that we've got one thing which will solve it all, or it's all rural, it's all urban. I definitely push urban agriculture, not because I think it solves everything. It needs to be urban, it needs to be policy, it needs to be rural. I do think urban needs to be part of the solution, and it can be a relatively large part of the solution. There's a recent study out of the UK that suggested maybe 40% of vegetable needs could be brought from growing in towns. Maybe that's a little at the high end. But I think it's going to be a valuable tool for addressing, I think, some challenges that come pretty much because we've got unused space. And I encourage, this is something that I do when I drive around in the car. I look at all the places that just look like dead, unused space to me. And I think to myself, what could we be using those for? Biodiversity is one thing, but food is another huge use for it. And with urban agriculture, potentially we can go another route and have much higher productivity. There are some sustainability issues to be solved with improving technologies, but you look to a country like the Netherlands, And, you know, it can produce on an acre like 20 times the number of tomatoes that you can in an open field. So it's got some of the attributes of a good solution. And then finally, there are growers in waiting. I believe there's an enthusiasm out there, especially in younger people, that we need to be looking at, and all those things together, I think, can make urban agriculture work. And then urban agriculture with these other solutions, I think, can, you know, give us a path forward.
Thank you, Matt. So I think we're out of time right now in our panel discussion. I'll say at a high level is thank you very much. Some of the common themes were focused not only on the supply side, but demand side, especially for healthy diets. I also heard as a recurring theme is really bridge some gaps in terms of skill set and incentivize people to get involved as a career. I also heard on the policy side that's really essential. While communities can do a lot, that policy advocacy skill, there's a missed opportunity there, and there's more. So you're going to get a summary. All the people here are going to get a summary of what our discussion today. It'll be in writing, also in a playbook that will be coming out later. And over to you, Patrick, to talk about that. Thank you very much. You're all great.
Just want to say thank you very kindly to all the guests for sharing your candid views and your passion. It's very much appreciated. Yasmin already mentioned this, but there will be an Insights for Action playbook coming off the back of this in June. So we're going to be culminating culminating all of the insights from the various speakers into an Insights for Action playbook, and there'll be a video that will be shared, which can be expected in June. We very much encourage a robust discussion from our audience as well as the panelists. So please reach out with any insights that you have. If you want to be engaged, we welcome that. There's some email links there that you can use to engage with us. And thank you all for joining. Last but not least, thank you to our sponsors. So Highgarden that spoke today, thank you very much. First Green Energy, the Feeding Cities Group, and the Big Carrot, and the Spent Goods Company. You'll see some links there for discounts from the Spent Goods Company, and I believe there's one coming from the Big Carrot. Sorry, there is one there from the Big Carrots as well. So encourage you to check out our sponsors, and thank you kindly to them.